What up, though? USHistoryAtlas.com. Primary sources. Great Law of Peace. Date around 1100. Place Onondaga Village near present day Syracuse, New York. Government document. Disgusted by endless tribal wars, the Kanawita and Ayanwata convinced the New York area nations of the Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneca, joined in 1720 by the Tuscarora, to join a federation named the Haudenosaunee, often called the Iroquois Federation. The Great Law of Peace was its federal constitution. It was recorded on 117 beaded belts, using symbols as memory aids rather than as specific words. The Great Law balanced power between the Federal Assembly, the nations, and transnational clans. Later, Americans, especially Benjamin Franklin, or shall we say, later Europeans or Afro-Eurasians or Caucasians or Anglo-Saxons, especially Benjamin Franklin, probably used ideas from the Great Law for the U.S. Constitution. It says it was recorded on 117 beaded belts using symbols as memory aids rather than as specific words. So, to be honest, the following words, as far as I'm concerned, they don't really mean anything. Because the Great Law of Peace, it says, was recorded on 117 beaded belts using symbol as memory aids rather than as specific words. So each one of the members or each one of their interpretations would have been slightly different. It says, I am the Kanawita. The Kanawita. Now, you've heard a lot of so-called African Americans or Black Americans, properly American Indians, names. And people oftentimes say, what was your mama thinking when she named you that? Or you hear a name and you be like, yeah, that's a black person. Yeah, that's a nigger name. But if you listen and you read this name, I am the Kanawita, and with the 5 nations, Confederate lords, I plant the tree of great peace. I plant it in your territory, Adodarho and the Onondaga Nation, in the territory of you who are the fire keepers. Roots have spread out from the tree of the great peace, one to the north, one to the east, one to the south, and one to the west. The name of these roots is the great white roots, and their name is peace and strength. If any man or any nation outside the 5 nations shall obey the laws of the great peace and make known their disposition to the lords of the confederacy, they may trace the roots to the tree, and if their minds are clean and they are obedient and promise to obey the wishes of the Confederate Council, they shall be welcome to take shelter beneath the tree of long leaves. When the lords are assembled, the council fire shall be kindled, but not with chestnut wood. And Adodarho shall formally open the council. Then shall Adodarho and his cousin lords, the fire keepers, announce the subject for discussion. All the business of the five nations confederate council shall be conducted by the two combined bodies of confederate lords. First, the question shall be passed upon by the Mohawk and Seneca lords. Then it shall be discussed and passed by the Oneida and Cayuga lords. Their decision shall then be referred to the Onondaga lords, fire keepers, for final judgment. It's interesting their choice of terms. The term Lord coming from the 117 beads on the belts. The same process shall obtain when a question is brought before the council by an individual or a war chief. In all cases, the procedure must be as follows. When the Mohawk and Seneca lords have unanimously agreed upon a question, they shall report their decision to the Cayuga and Oneida lords, who shall deliberate upon the question and report a unanimous decision to the Mohawk lords. The Mohawk will then report the standing of the case to the fire keepers, who shall render a decision as they see fit in case of disagreement by the two bodies, or confirm the decisions of the two bodies if they are identical, or confirm the decisions of the two bodies if they are identical. The fire keepers shall then report their decision to the Mohawk, who shall announce it to the open council. A bunch of a certain number of wampum strings, each 2 spans in length, shall be given to each of the female families in which the lordship titles are vested. The right of bestowing the title shall be hereditary in the family of the females legally possessing the bunch of shell strings, and the string shall be the token that the females of the family have the propriety right to the lordship title for all time to come, subject to certain restrictions hereinafter mentioned. If at any time it shall be manifest that a confederate lord has not in mind the welfare of the people, or disobeys the rules of this great law, the men or women of the confederacy, or both jointly, shall come to the council It says, I, Dekanawida, and the Union Lords, now uproot the tallest pine tree, and into the cavity thereby made we cast all weapons of war. Into the depths of the earth, down into the deep under earth currents of water flowing to unknown regions, we cast all the weapons of strife. We bury them from the sight, and we plant again the tree. Thus shall the great peace be established, and hostilities shall no longer be known between the 5 nations, but peace to the united people. When the Confederate Council of the 5 nations has for its object the establishment of the great peace among the people of an outside nation, and that nation refuses to accept the great peace, then by such refusal they bring a declaration of war upon themselves from the 5 nations. Then shall the 5 nations seek to establish the great peace by a conquest of the rebellious nation. When the men of the 5 nations, now called forth to become warriors, are ready for battle with an obstinate opposing nation that has refused to accept the great peace, then one of the 5 war chiefs shall be chosen by the warriors of the 5 nations to lead the army into battle. Whenever a specially important matter or a great emergency is presented before the Confederate Council and the nature of the matter affects the entire body of the 5 nations, threatening their utter ruin, then the lords of the Confederacy must submit the matter to the decision of their people, and the decision of the people shall affect the decision of the Confederate Council. This decision shall be a confirmation of the voice of the people. And in order to understand this great law of peace, you should study on your own. You should dissect on your own. One thing is for certain. One thing is definitely presents itself over and over, and that's this word Confederate and Confederacy. What comes to mind with you when you hear the word Confederate or Confederacy? A lot of people feel a certain thing when they see a Confederate flag. The men of every clan of the 5 nations shall have a council fire ever burning in readiness for a council of the clan, when it seems necessary for a council to be held to discuss the welfare of the clans, then the men may gather about the fire. This council shall have the same rights as the council of the women. The women of every clan of the 5 nations shall have a council fire ever burning in readiness for a council of the clan, when in their opinion it seems necessary for the interests of the people. They shall hold a council, and their decisions and recommendations shall be introduced before the council of the lords by the war chief for its consideration. Before the real people united their nations, each nation had its council fires. Before the great peace, their councils were held. The 5 council fires shall continue to burn as before, and they are not quenched. The lords of each nation in future shall settle their nation's affairs at this council fire, governed always by the laws and rules of the Council of the Confederacy and by the great peace. If the complaint of the people through the war chief is not heeded the first time, it shall be uttered again, and then if no attention is given, a third complaint and warning shall be given. If the Lord is contumacious, the matter shall go to the council of war chiefs. The war chief shall then divest the erring lords of his title by order of the women in whom the titleship is vested. When the Lord is deposed, the women shall notify the Confederate lords through their war chief, and the Confederate lords shall sanction, the act. The women will then select another of their sons as a candidate, and the lords shall elect him. Should any man of the nation assist with special ability or show great interest in the affairs of the nation, the Confederate lords may elect him to a seat with them, and he may sit in the Confederate council. He shall be proclaimed a pine tree sprung up for the nation, and shall be installed as such at the next assembly for the installation of lords. Should he ever do anything contrary to the rules of the great peace, he may not be deposed from office. No one shall cut him down, but thereafter Everyone shall be deaf to his voice and his advice. Should he resign his seat and title, no one shall prevent him. A pine tree chief has no authority to name a successor, nor is his title hereditary. The war chief shall be selected from the eligible sons of the female families holding the head lordship titles. There shall be one war chief for each nation, and their duty shall be to carry messages for their lords and to take up the arms of war in case of emergency. They shall not participate in the proceedings of the Confederate Council, but shall watch his progress, and in case of an erroneous action by a lord, they shall receive the complaints of the people and convey the warnings of the women to him. The people who wish to convey messages to the lords in the Confederate Council shall do so through the war chiefs of their nation. It shall ever be his duty to lay the cases, questions, and propositions of the people before the Confederate Council. These claims distributed through their respective nations shall be the sole owners and holders of the soil of this country, and in them is it vested as a birthright. People of the 5 nations, members of a certain clan, shall recognize every other member of that clan, irrespective of the nation, as relatives. Men and women, therefore, members of the same clan, are forbidden to marry. The lineal descent of the people of the 5 nations shall run in the female line. Women shall be considered the progenitors of the nation. They shall own the land and the soil. Men and women shall follow the status of the mother. That was far from the concept of the head of the household or the head of the family. And I'm sure most of you know what the definition of family is. And if you don't, you should look up the etymology of the word family. I'm not sure it's what you think. But that last paragraph says, the lineal descent of the people of the 5 nations shall run in the female line. Women shall be considered the progenitors of the nation. They shall own the land and the soil. Men and women shall follow the status of the mother. I'm not saying that your family followed the great law of peace, but how would you know if you haven't taken the time to find out who your family is and what your story is? I'm not saying start calling yourself one of the 5 nations of the Confederacy who are spoke of in the great law of peace. I'm saying find out what your people called themselves. Because it's obvious that everything that someone else has called you has been false. What you call yourself, most times, what we have called ourselves has been false. But it's clear to me from that great law of peace that there was something happening here in America. And it was happening because of us, the American Indians. or those who you term Black Americans or African Americans. You know, those of us, those people, those Black Americans that don't have culture. Cultural survival. The 1893 Chicago World's Fair, an American Indian Agency, and American Indian Agency by Emily Sanders. Students of Indian schools were flaunted as marks of successful progress toward the civilization and assimilation of Native Americans. Students of Indian schools were flaunted as marks of successful progress toward the civilization and assimilation of Native Americans. It says the assimilation of Native Americans. It's almost as if you are considered a Native American because you are assimilated. They said Native Americans when referring to civilization and assimilation. They did not say American Indians. Let's shake it. Again, natives began to make and sell materials to collectors building archaeological exhibits and even sold indigenous wisdom. Sold indigenous wisdom. The game is to be sold, not told, right? Natives began to make and sell materials to collectors building archaeological exhibits. Now, when you think of archaeology, you think of things that are ancient, things that were made in antiquity. Now, why would they be building an archaeological exhibit with things that were currently being made? Who taught them how to make those things? And what did those things really represent? Well, they represented the civilization and assimilation of the Native American. The face of the new non-for-profit companies. Elders sometimes decided to transfer knowledge to museums because they thought that knowledge within the community was disappearing quickly, and they needed that knowledge to remain for their grandchildren to see and learn from. Keep the lie alive. Indian participants in the Chicago World's Fair manipulated what was intended as a denial of their distinct presence in the modern world into an opportunity to exercise their agency and further cultural goals. Chicago Architecture Center, World's Columbian Exposition of 1893. World meets Chicago. The World's Columbian Exposition of 1893 was the first World's Fair held in Chicago, carving out some 600 acres of Frederick Law Olmsted's Jackson Park. The exposition was a major milestone. Congress awarded Chicago the opportunity to host the fair over the other candidate cities of New York, D.C., and St. Louis. More than 150,000 people passed through the grounds each day during its 6-month run, making it larger than all of the U.S. World's Fairs that preceded it. So momentous was the fair that it is represented as a star on the Chicago flag. The fair promoted the rapid urbanization of the South Side. New corridors of development grew along the lake and the new elevated L train line, today's CTA Green Line. And new housing blocks were built for the fair's workers. Entertainment venues and hotels sprung up in nearby Hyde Park and Woodlawn, too, some of which would evolve into major resort destinations through the mid 20th century. This is architecture.org, and it says Legacy of the Fair. The millions of visitors who came to Chicago during the fair took home new ideas in commerce, industry, technology, and entertainment. This was better than TV. This was even more effective than TV. This was propaganda at its finest. Although the TV is A1 in propaganda. Britannica Online Encyclopedia, World's Columbian Exposition. Fair held in 1893 in Chicago, Illinois. The Illinois Indians, the Illinois, to celebrate the 400th anniversary of Christopher Columbus's voyage to America. They're celebrating Christopher Columbus, Cristobal. They're celebrating him. The Ferris wheel, invented by G.W.G. Ferris, a Pittsburgh engineer, and a dazzling new wonder, electricity, were presented for the first time in America. Electricity had been introduced and exploited at the Paris Exposition of 1889, but in 1893 it was still unfamiliar to most Americans. Maybe you can take some time out, look up some of the American inventors, or who you would term, or some people would term, Black Americans or African American inventors, properly American inventors. During that time of 1893, during the mid 1800s, up until the mid 1900s, and familiarize yourself with who actually were the people who were inventing things. Actually, I have a show coming up where I'm going to touch on a few of those. The exposition was opened by a dramatic act when U.S. President Grover Cleveland pushed the button on a ceremonial platform in front of the administration building and set the Great Alice engine in motion, turning on the electric power for the exposition. I wonder whose patent he was using, who invention he was using. No doubt someone had a patent in there for this electricity harnessing. There were some 21.5 million paid admissions to the exposition, and actual total attendance, including free admissions, was more than 25.8 million. And this is 1893. This is the time when one of the largest waves of European foreigners, European immigrants, European slaves, people who were coming for work, indentured servants. This is during the time one of the largest waves of Europeans were coming to Ellis Island. Just a mental note. Library of Congress. The 1893 World Columbian Exposition in Chicago. Expositions are the timekeepers of progress. They stimulate the energy, enterprise, and intellect of the people and quicken human genius. They go into the home. They broaden and brighten the daily life of the people. They open mighty storehouses of information to the student. Ah, the wonders of education. Who educated you? Was it your people? Dvorak met one of his most important students at the exposition, African American violinist and composer Will Marion Cook. That's fine. There's just one mistake. 1893, large groups of people weren't calling themselves African Americans. So who is he talking about? Who is Will Marion Cook? I'm going to leave that to you to look up. But I'm going to go out on a limb and take a guess. He's an American. Possibly the only American there. No, not the only one there. Only one is being spoke of. In 1902, the African American, or properly American Indian vaudevillians Bert Williams and George Walker collaborated with composer Will Marion Cook, another American Indian writer Paul Laurence Dunbar, who did attend to create in Dahomey, a musical fantasy about two American blacks, or two properly American Indians, who gain control of that African nation. So, in 1902, two American vaudevillians collaborated with another American, another nigga, and writer Paul Laurence Dunbar, and did a fantasy musical about two Americans who gained control of an African nation called Dahomey. Dahomey. No, I'm not pronouncing that right, but it's interesting nonetheless. Very interesting. World History Connected, Volume 13, Issue 3, Fair Representation, American Indians and the 1893 Chicago World's Columbian Exposition, David R. M. Beck. In conjunction with the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, Frederick Jackson Turner famously declared that the frontier had closed. Arguments regarding the accuracy of his declaration aside, the seminal change it represented was an outcome of the American project of expansion from a small nation hugging the Atlantic. See? Understand where they're coming from. Understand what the United States was. The seminal change it represented was an outcome of the American project of expansion, or the United States, or the United States project of expansion, or the United Colonies project of expansion from a small nation hugging Atlantic seaboard to a transcontinental entity on the cusp of becoming the greatest world power. Diabolical. The way these groups of people, these foreigners, strategically wash over the land, wash over the soil, until they infest it all. From a settler colonial or settler indigenous perspective, this project was achieved by the disposition of the land's original inhabitants, of the bulk of their real estate and resources. This ushered in an abrupt new era of history for the American Indians. By the late 19th century, American Indian economies across the continent and indeed across the Americas had been largely destroyed by a combination of imperial expansion and colonial and federal governmental policies. Listen to this. By the late 19th century, which means the late 1800s, American Indian economies across the continent, pause there. Not Native American economies. And this isn't a shot at the Native Americans. I mean, I don't know any Native Americans. I don't have any issues with Native Americans. I don't know any Native Americans. So how can you have an issue with someone you don't know? But listen, by the late 1800s, American Indian economies, if the Native Americans aren't who they're referring to, who are they referring to? They're referring to you. They're referring to your family. I'm sorry. They're referring to your people. Your first, second, third, fourth great grandparents. This is who they're referring to because they are the only ones that had economies across the continent. You don't believe me? Look it up. Look it up. In one of the previous articles, I told you to look up who were the people inventing things and getting patents who looked like you. And then I said, whoa, just watch one of my forthcoming shows, and I'm going to touch on that. The 1893 World Columbian Exposition offered economic opportunities to Indians, but their participation in the fair also caused a scramble among a variety of actors to take control of the Indian presence. A variety of actors to take control of the Indian presence, of niggas' presence. I wish we could put all this stuff to rest once and for all. The only time you've heard African is when they falsely called Americans African Americans, or when they said that the two American vaudevillians, the two nigger vaudevillians, and the composer wrote a musical about two Americans taking over an African nation. Why would two Americans be taking over an African nation if, like some of y'all believe, that you African? Why would they say two Africans gonna take over the people who they come from nation? It don't make sense, do it? A lot of things don't make sense. A variety of actors to take control of the Indian presence. A variety of interests. Hold on, let me go back. As part of this competition, a variety of interests work to create an identity for American Indians that would meet their own purposes. As part of this competition, a variety of interests work to create an identity for American Indians that would meet their own purposes. See? simmered to a fine stew. Mwah. The 1893 World's Columbian Exposition brought American Indians and other indigenous peoples to Chicago to be put on display for the 27 million visitors who attended the fair. A battle over who would control their representation to the broader world took place. We're talking a battle between the American Indians and other indigenous peoples. The 1893 World's Columbian Exposition brought American Indians and other indigenous peoples to Chicago to be put on display for the 27 million visitors who attended the fair. Not Native Americans, not Anglo-Saxons, American Indians and other indigenous peoples. A battle over who would control their representation to the broader world took place. This battle both shaped and foreshadowed the imagery of Indians that the American public would accept for decades to come. I mean, when it works, it works. When you got a plan, you got a plan. It worked. It worked. Listen. The battle both shaped and foreshadowed the imagery of Indians that the American public would accept for decades to come. Historians and cultural commentators have paid attention to this, but have thus far failed to give it the complex treatment that it deserves. Multiple actors, including Indians themselves, presented or attempted to present Indians and other indigenous peoples to multiple audiences at the fair. In 1893, in the words of scholar Carl Smith, Chicago put on the most successful of all world's fairs. Most American Indians who came to the fair came to work. Who was working at the fair? American Indians were working at the fair. Not Native Americans, American Indians were working at the fair. Who are the American Indians? Well, they're the only Americans in America today. The social meanings and implications of their representation and experiences provide valuable insights into the American and the Native American psyche of the late 19th century. The social meanings and implications of their representation, the American Indians. Most American Indians who came to the fair came to work. That was your people. They was doing all manner of work. Look into your family. Ask your family questions. Ask them if they worked at the Chicago World's Fair. The social meaning and implications of their representation and experiences provide valuable insights into the American and the Native American psyche of the late 19th century. Numerous competing perspectives infused the efforts of those who were displaying Indians. For the most part, they did not reflect Indian reality in the late 19th century, in the late 1800s. They did, however, help create and cement American cultural stereotypes about Indians that would both impede Indian efforts to succeed in modern America and help define the scholarly literature regarding the fair for a long time to come. Representations of American Indians at the fair failed to give accurate perspectives to the European public, to the foreigner public, to the American public, to the foreigners who were considered Americans, public regarding who Indians really were and their role in the modern American cultural world. See, all the public knew who the Indians were. This was more to do with who the Indians would remain, who they would be in years to come, and for all time. Well, not for all time, because today, I think the buck stops here. The representations of American Indians at the fair. Indians as objects of science, Indians as assimilating into American society or United States society, Indians as romantic images and actors reflecting a bygone era. This is a portrait of U.S. Army veteran Cornelius Cusick. It says, Tuscarora Indian, who collected material for Frederick Ward Putnam for the World's Fair exhibits. This was an image of himself that he chose to share with friends. Photo from National Archives and Records Administration, Washington, D.C., Record Group 94. It says, yours truly, Cornelius Cusick. And it says that he identifies as a Tuscarora Indian. So he is a Native American. I'll give him that. He's a Native American. He was born in America. And I guess his new company is called Tuscarora. Can anyone guess what this is? What this is a representation of? I mean, him calling himself a Tuscarora Indian and him clearly being an Anglo-Saxon, a Caucasian, a European, a Afro-Eurasian. What is this? What do you call this when this happens? Identity theft. Frederick Ward Putnam, a Harvard University anthropologist, took a 2-year leave of absence from his job overseeing the Peabody Museum to develop the anthropological display at the exposition. This work included organizing a living ethnological village of American Indians from several different tribes in the United States and Canada that would be open to the public. See, this is indoctrination. This is education. This is indoctrination. Because the Indians, the American Indians, your people, your family, they were everywhere. They are the Americans. Early on, they said they were celebrating the 400th year since Christopher Columbus landed on our shores. Christopher Columbus knew who the Americans are. You mean to tell me that they don't know who the Americans are? Yeah, they know who we is. But they're putting together an exposition to show you who they want you to believe the American Indians are from that day Fourth, he wanted these to be purely Indian in character. This would ignore contemporary Indian community realities in an effort to show fairgoers idealized pre-Columbian lifeways of the peoples of the Americas. Putnam said, "The purpose of the ethnographical exhibition is for scientific study of the Indian in his primitive life, and that the United States government undertakes to represent the progress made by the Indian in education and civilization, thus completing their history up to the present time." They wanted to show you, or they wanted to sell you, a civilized version of who the Americans were or who the Americans are. And they're still doing it to this day. It's getting weak. It's weakening. But it's still being done, and it's still, I said it's weakening. I didn't say it wasn't strong. It's weakening, but it is still strong. He intended that his ethnological village, in conjunction with the displays on physical anthropology and archaeology in the anthropology building, would provide a primitivistic baseline to contrast science and progress. Some of the Indians who worked to collect materials for the fair also did so in order to help present Indians from a scientific perspective. Indians from a scientific perspective. Captain Cornelius Cusick. Remember the Tuscarora Company, right? Captain Cornelius Cusick hailed from a family that had strong connections to Henry Rowe Schoolcraft, and he viewed himself as an ethnologist. Cusick was a Tuscarora Indian, one of the tribes of the Iroquois Confederacy from New York. He was a leader within his tribe before he entered the United States Army. He did collecting work for Putnam. Terrell Bradby, a Pamunkey Indian man from Virginia who collected for the Smithsonian, viewed this work as scientific in basis. And George Hunt, the Indian cultural mediator from the Northwest Coast, spent much of the rest of his adult life working with Franz Boas. And during the fair, Franz Boas, someone who was highly esteemed to Zora Neale Hurston. And during the fair, co-presented a scientific paper with him at the 1893 Anthropological Congress. The Smithsonian Institute developed its exhibits of mannequins dressed in various tribal attire in village scenes, with a focus on science as well. However, it did not use living Indians as part of the exhibit. I wonder why. Because they probably was doing something else, minding their business, working on the sets, catering the event, shining shoes. Giving people Ubers, ride shares, providing them with hotel rooms, and all manner of things. The United States government's American Indian School House stood in close proximity to the ethnological village. The United States government's American Indian School House stood in close proximity to the ethnological village, an intended juxtaposition of imagery. The school was intended to portray the federal government's heroic efforts to assimilate children, The Canadian government created a similar school exhibit with the purpose of showing the successful efforts of both missionaries and government officials in their assimilation work. The missionary, the school, the missionary, the United States government's American Indian Schoolhouse. See how they go hand in hand? And government officials in their assimilation work. With this United States government exhibit, Morgan wrote that nearby will be the ethnological exhibit where Indian families dressed in native costume. Where Indian families dressed in native costume. Costume. Halloween. The Indian village was to provide a foil to contrast not only the development of modern America, but also the work of missionaries and government school educators. School and church. Yeah. Some of the most effective indoctrination and programming tools was the missionaries, the church, and the school. And you are still accepting those things today. The Jesus that they brought you, the Bible that they brought you, is your most prized possession. And education in their schoolhouses for your children. And we won't even talk about what has to happen before your children can attend the first day of class. Yes, they have to visit the clinic. You know, they poke around your kid, your child. That Bible is your most prized possession. And a lot of you hold education in the highest regard. As historian L.G. Moses describes it, in telling his story of the triumph of civilization over savagery, Cody reminded his audiences that where once Euro-Americans, or we're going to do this the right way, reminded his audience that where once Europeans and American Indians had met as enemies, challenging each other for mastery of a continental empire. No, they weren't challenging each other for mastery of a continental empire. The American Indians told you Europeans that, okay, you've been here long enough. It's time for y'all to go home. They must now live together as friends. No, we must not. We do not have to live as friends. We are not Quakers. His Wild West program presented Indians as valiant but unsuccessful protectors of homelands who could stoically accept defeat. Thank you. Why, thank you, Cody. That was very kind of you. To say that we are valiant, but we lost, which is not true. I mean, look at some of the American Indians, the Americans who you term Black Americans or African Americans, in every level of the United States administration, who are telling you that you have no choice but to lose, while they wear cowboy hats that cost $2,000 and pinky rings that look like NBA championship rings. Let's shake it. Cody put on more than 660 shows during the fair. Cody presented Indians in this way to portray to the public his self-proclaimed mission to bring the white and red races closer together. Cody put on more than 660 shows during the fair and regularly sent his Indian performers to represent the romantic past at events across the fairgrounds. The Indians who worked for Buffalo Bill were easily the most visible at the exposition. They played an important role in shaping the public's perceptions of who Indian people were. And although it worked then, if it's still working today, if the public's perception is still that these performers are the American Indians, are the Americans, the only Americans in America today, it's not their fault. It's not their fault at all. The Lakota who worked for Buffalo Bill regularly wore their regalia in public. Cody viewed their visibility as an opportunity for free advertising. Today, with their antics during the Wild West program, together with their antics during the Wild West program and the encampment, teepees and campfires, they left most who saw them with the impression that they had seen real or representative Indians. Now, I didn't put quotation marks around the word real. They put quotation marks around the word real. This is worldhistorykonnected.press.edu. They put quotation marks around the word real. Together with the employees, the Lakota Native American employees of Cody, together with their antics during the Wild West program and the encampment teepees and campfires, they left most who saw them with the impression that they had seen, quote, real, end quote, or representative Indians. Already, Plains Indians were viewed by the public as prototypical Indians, and those who worked for Buffalo Bill reinforced this perception. Plains Indians. Chinos. Siberians. Anglo-Saxons. Romans. Already, Plains Indians were viewed by the public as prototypical Indians, and those who worked for Buffalo Bill reinforced this perception. Yeah, they used the Plains Indians. They forgot about your family in California. They forgot about your family in Kentucky, and Arkansas, and Georgia, Louisiana, Texas, Alabama, Mississippi, Florida, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, New York, Iowa, Illinois, Missouri, Ohio, Tennessee. Yeah, they forgot about all your people. They say, hey, we're going to make the Plains Indian the face of the company. Already, Plains Indians, together with their antics during the Wild West program, John Wayne and Tonto and the Lone Ranger. Together with their antics during the Wild West program and the encampment teepees and campfires, they left most who saw them with the impression that they had seen, quote, real, end quote, or representative Indians. With the impression that they seen real Indians, but the real Indians was around the corner. Already, Plains Indians were viewed by the public as prototypical Indians, and those who worked for Buffalo Bill reinforced this perception. One of Cody's employees, I said it, didn't I? I said his employees, his workers, his employees. One of Cody's employees, Short Bull, or Short Bull. They be having them names, man. That's a telltale sign. It's a dead giveaway, man. You know what I mean? Skipping Pigeon and Sad Bear and Stumbling Peacock. You know what I mean? And Dizzy Hawk and whatnot. One of Cody's employees, Short Bull, even served as a model for a statue depicting a Potawatomi man crafted by the famed sculptor Carl Roll Smith. Short Bull served as a model for a statue depicting someone who he wasn't. Short Bull, one of Cody's employees, committed identity theft. Crafted by the famed sculptor Carl Roll Smith, the statue stood in or near downtown Chicago for many years. Roll Smith did not seem to think the Potawatomis looked Indian enough for public display. They didn't look Indian enough for public display. They didn't look Native American enough. They didn't look Hollywood ready. Today they do, but at that time they wasn't Hollywood ready. They wasn't ready for show business, man. Act 1. In contrast to Cody's romanticized focus, the exhibits on the Midway Plaisance titillated audiences by portraying Indians in a way that would strike fear into the audience, or at least make fairgoers shudder at the recent Western American past. Who was the audience of the Chicago Fair? Who was the audience? If anyone, look, I guess this is rhetorical, but I do want you to dig into this. And because the pictures are there, they have pictures of the 1893 Chicago's Fair. They do. Who was the audience? It was millions of people who passed through. Did your family go? The competition for representation of India. This is the conclusion of the paper? Oh, okay. It's more, but wow. It's mentioned Indians a lot. They always talking about a nigger. They always examining a nigger. You notice that? Do you notice that everything All roads lead to the American Indian. The competition for representation of Indians was won by several parties. The competition for representation of Indians was won by several parties, including Putnam Cody, the United States Indian Service, and the Smithsonian. All except the American Indian. Everybody. Oh, it says it in the next line, but not by Indians themselves. Thank you. National Archives. Dawes Rolls. The Dawes Roll, also known as the Final Rolls, are the list of individuals who were accepted as eligible for tribal membership in the 5 civilized tribes. 5 civilized tribes. Remember? Civilization and assimilation. 5 civilized tribes. Hey, remember the Tuscarora? Homie, that's a Tuscarora? The Anglo-Saxon? The Anglo-Saxon Tuscarora from the East Coast. He looks exactly like people who you never see. As an Indian. 5 civilized tribes. The Dawes Rolls, also known as the Final Rolls, are the list of individuals who were accepted as eligible for tribal membership. Membership into a tribe, membership into a family, membership into your people, membership to Thanksgiving dinner. 5 civilized membership in the 5 civilized tribes: Cherokee, Creeks, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Seminoles. It does not include those whose applications were stricken, rejected, or judged as doubtful. Those found eligible for the final rolls were entitled to an allotment of land, usually as a homestead. See, this is kind of like what you've witnessed in the recent past. People getting flued out to the United States and provided with food, clothing, and shelter to this day. The rolls contain more than 101,000 names from 1898, which was yesterday, to 1914, primarily from 1899 to 1906. They can be searched to discover the enrollee's name, sex, blood degree, and census card number. Blood degree. Today, these 5 tribes continue to use the Dawes Rolls as the basis for determining tribal membership. They usually require applicants to provide proof of descent from a person who was listed on these rolls. You see, proof of descent from a person who was listed on the rolls, not proof of descent that you are an American Indian and you are from this soil, that you sprouted up from this soil. Nah, you don't have to prove that. You got to prove that you knew somebody who owned these rolls. That's it. Because then that way we could trust you. We could trust you to come to the party. If you do not know the person's tribe, you can look for clues in the 1900 census. For those Indians living in predominantly Indian areas, there were special Indian schedules in the 1900 census identifying one's tribe and parents' tribes. For those Indians living amongst the general population, only one's color or race was designated, such as Indian or white. They make it easy. They make it easy to keep you out. See, this is what people mean when they say paper genocide. it's easy to keep you out. But why would you want to go in? Why would you need a membership card to join your people? See, it don't make sense. A lot of things just don't make sense. You put sense to them. You make sense of them. You make them make sense. And they just don't make sense. They don't make natural sense. Yeah, they may make common sense, but not natural sense. Listen, for those Indians living in predominantly Indian areas, like the whole America, there were special Indian schedules in the 1900 census identify. See, they're in control of saying who is who now. If someone else is in control of telling you who you are, what happens? Well, you become a black. For those Indians living in predominantly Indian areas, there were special Indian schedules in the 1900 census identifying one's tribe and parent tribes. For those Indians living among the general population, for those Indians living among the general population and not in no designated federally recognized Indian area, for those Indians living among the general population of America, only one's color or race was designated, such as Indian or white. If your ancestor's tribe is not identified in the 1900 census, once you find where your ancestor was living, you can consult books such as The Indian Tribes of North America by John R. Swanton for information on the tribes living in each state. Other good sources are A Guide to the Indian Tribes of Oklahoma by Muriel H. Wright and The Indians of Texas by W. W. Newcomb Jr. for tribes in those areas. So go look what a foreigner said you are. And go look at where a foreigner said your family was, and he gonna tell you what your family is. This is from the archives. Whitewashing art. Archive.com. Whitewash is the general name for oil-based white mineral dyes that are used in painting. The choice of the right white has become an important factor for artists because whitewash serves as the basis for oil paints and painting techniques, determines the contrast and tonal range of the image. Craftsmen use dye to obtain a desired hue, overpaint a finished color, or fill the background. Thanks to whitewash, the eyes of models come to life in portraits. Winter landscapes shine with dozens of shades of snow, and silver dishes in still lifes leave no doubt about the hostess's diligence and cleanliness. From ancient times to the present day, painters could not do without a luminous snow white dye. Medieval and Renaissance painters used white lead, light fast, quick drying, and deadly poisonous. In the 1820s, a French chemist prepared a zinc dye. Light in the 1820s, a French chemist prepared a zinc dye, light, brittle, translucent. In the 1920s, the painting palette received titanium white, thick and bright. Each composition created a unique effect on the canvas. Warm shades of white lead were present in the images of sunrise and sunset. Coal blush zinc colors were in transparent winter landscapes. This is from the BBC, British Broadcasting Company. I believe that's what that stands for. How Black Women Were Whitewashed by Art by Sophia Smith Galler. All the beautiful, powerful, black-skinned females from mythology and history were erased by Western art, argues Sophia Smith Galler. Well, Miss Galler, there is no such thing as a black-skinned female. Now you're blackwashing, which in turn means that you are whitewashing, because black means pale or bleached. So, Sophia Smith Galler says that all the beautiful, powerful, black-skinned females from mythology and history were erased by Western art. She's actually contributing to their erasure. Because again, black means pale or bleached. Yikes. Anyone who watched either of the two Clash of the Titans films will know that Judy Bowker and Alexa Davalos are both white women. And anyone who has seen Andromeda in a painting, perhaps Titans or pointers or Titians and pointers, will believe she is white too. But McGrath's article was definitive in addressing three things: that all the Greek mythographers placed Andromeda as a princess of Ethiopia, that Ovid specifically refers to her dark skin, and that artists throughout Western art history frequently omitted to depict her blackness because Andromeda was supposed to be beautiful, and blackness and beauty, for many of them, was dichotomous. There is no doubt about Andromeda's race, according to Professor McGrath. Yet, Renaissance art repeatedly depicts Andromeda as white. In Piero di Cosimo's Perseus freeing Andromeda from the 1510s, she is actually whiter than all the figures around her, including a black musician and her parents, who are considerably darker and in exotic costume. We do know that there was active debate about her skin color, a debate that would certainly seem racist to modern eyes. McGrath references Francisco Pacheco, a Spanish artist and writer, who asked in one passage of his book why Andromeda is so often painted as white-skinned when several of the sources say she is black. Here we go with the black. I'm not going to spend any time speaking about black anymore. By now, you should understand, especially if you've watched my shows. He obviously got a terrible shock that Ovid could be talking about a woman as beautiful but black. McGrath tells BBC Culture, almost 3 decades after the publication of her article, books such as Pacheco's were used as reference guides for painters on how to paint who and what. So it's easy to see how his views could have spread. Black Andromedas were few and far between. And images like Bernard Picard's print of Perseus, 1731, and Andromeda by Abraham van Diepenbeek, 1655, appear to show a woman with stereotypical white features and hair, but with dark skin. Andromeda is not the only black figure in art that this has happened to. Far from it. In fact, the whitewashing of Andromeda was prefigured in Renaissance Europe by Christianity. Michael Ohajuru, an art historian who leads tours around London's galleries examining the representation of black people in art, came to study Renaissance art history through his fascination with the Black Magus. This was one of the three kings or magi depicted in the Nativity's adoration of the Magi scenes. Typically the giver of myrrh, Ohajuru was surprised at the positivity of this figure that contrasted with history's many depictions of black people in servile roles. He says, the black king was used as a positive figure, he says, symbolizing a young African continent that had come to join Europe and Asia in Christianity. He was used as an example of bringing the world together in the end times. Ohajuru searched for the Black King's supposed origins and found them in the travels of Sir John Mandeville, a 14th century text, which says that the Black Magus was from Saba, or Saba, a kingdom in Ethiopia. You tell me, what is Ethiopia? I'm not sure. All it takes is a few minutes of searching Queen of Sheba painting on Google Images to see a litany of reclining, exoticized white women glancing languorously either at the viewer or King Solomon. There were once some depictions of the Queen of Sheba as dark-skinned, but the Renaissance saw her whitewashing and sexualization on a grand scale. For Ahura, it jars with the earlier depictions of her, such as that scene at the altarpiece of Klosterneuburg in Austria, which portrays her visiting the king next to an image of the Adoration of the Magi. She was used as a prefiguration, a foreteller, a prophesizer, that a king would visit the baby Jesus, just as a queen visited Solomon. By the 18th century, she is no longer a queen meeting a king to have a healthy debate. She is an idolatrous seductress. The translation of the Bible from which Renaissance artists would have been working had also gone through several iterations since its creation. McGrath writes in The Black Andromeda about how in the original Hebrew and then Greek, the Queen of Sheba declares in the Song of Solomon in the Old Testament, I am black and beautiful. By the time this makes it into the 405 AD translation into Latin Vulgate and becomes but I am black, but beautiful. In England, the 1611 publication of the King James Bible changed it even further. I am black, but comely. Perhaps it's this phrase, rather than any painting, that has been the most destructive of them all. Black is beautiful. I agree. Black is just black. Peter Paul Rubens, the artist credited with making Big beautiful, also made black beautiful in the Four Rivers in the 1610. The Four Rivers are personified and everyone is well pretty Rubenesque, with ripping muscles and heaving bosoms. In the middle sits the Nile, the only figure to stare directly at the viewer. Her nudity is tantalizingly hidden. Her skin is dark, and she is by far the most bejeweled figure in the piece. Yes, she's exoticized, but there's a power to her, and she's equal to the white women in the image. There was an interest in painting black people in Antwerp, partly because of the conversion of black people, partly because people actually saw black people in the streets, says McGrath. These do, however, remain anomalies in Western art history, McGrath explains. One reason that the Black King goes out of favor is that people, religious artists, and theologians are not so interested in the old religious symbolism of Ethiopia and the Gentiles. And so figures whose Ethiopianness was part of their appeal were simply seen as unimportant. And there's a picture of the Queen of Sheba. I guess that's a production or something. But you can't be mad at people for painting people the way they want to paint them. They're telling their story. You have to tell your story. For Michael Ohajuru on his art tours, that's why it's all the more important to try and locate the few representations of the Black Queen of Sheba and the Black Andromeda and to find out why they disappeared. The huge influence that Western art history has had on our imagination when it comes to visualizing figures from the Bible or classics is arguably one that needs constant interrogation. Under such a lens, Gina Lollobrigida, playing the Queen of Sheba in the 1950s, or Alexa Davalos playing Andromeda, become problematic, but expected. But expected. The ancient world. Forbes. Whitewashing ancient statues. Whiteness, racism, and color in the ancient world. Sarah Bond. Historian, digital humanist, and baseball fan. Ooh. April 2017. Although we often romanticize the bare marble of ancient sculpture today, most of these specimens were in fact painted in bright shades of blue, red, yellow, brown, and many other hues. Over the past few decades, scientists have worked diligently to study the often minute traces of paint, inlay, and gold leaf used on ancient statues, and to use digital technologies to restore them to their original polychromy. If we know these statues were polychromatic, why do they remain lily white in our popular imagination? If we know these statues were polychromatic, why do they remain lily white in our popular imagination? This is for a question of all. This question is to all you, to all the Pan-African people. This is a question to everyone who believes that these lily white renditions are supreme over them. Answer the question. Before a show on color and antiquity at Frankfurt's art historian Max Holin noted that well into the 21st century, well into the 2000s, the idea of a pure marble white antiquity prevailed despite many hints that sculpture was often painted. One influential purveyor of this falsehood was Johann Joachim Winckelmann. His 2 volumes on the history of ancient art, were hugely popular in Europe and helped define art history as we know it today. They also perpetrated and further entrenched the idea that white marble statues, like the famed Apollo of Belvedere, were the epitome of beauty. The Apollo of the Belvedere is itself a marble copy of a Greek original likely done in bronze in the 4th century BCE. In bronze. During the Roman Empire of the 2nd and 3rd century CE, sculptors made use of a marble more regularly in their copies or bronze originals. So why would you not think that the copper colored people, the American Indians, the only copper colored people of this soil, all shades of copper, why wouldn't you think the images would be whitewashed? Debaters. During the Roman Empire of the 2nd and 3rd century CE, sculptors made use of a marble more regularly in their copies of bronze originals. As Emerita Princeton historian Nell Irvin Painter details in her book, The History of White People, as she puts it, color in sculpture came to mean barbarism. Romans had a great variety of skin tones within their Mediterranean world. Frescoes, mosaics, and painted ceramics from both the Greek and Roman periods reveal a fascination with black Africans and particularly Ethiopians, but did not employ what W.E.B. Du Bois would call a color prejudice. Although Romans generally differentiated people on their cultural and ethnic background rather than the color of their skin, ancient sources do occasionally mention skin tone, and artists try to convey the color of their flesh. Classical artistic depictions could indeed exaggerate facial features in a way not dissimilar to the racist knickknacks that can still be found in flea markets and antique shops across the country. Yet ancient persons did not engage in the construct of biological racism. As Emeritus Howard University classicist Frank Snowden has pointed out, nothing comparable to the virulent color prejudice of modern times existed in the ancient world. Museums present viewers with a false color binary of the ancient world. The excellent Tumblr, People of Color in European Art History, addresses the dearth of people of color in art history, and museums should take note. As noted on their Tumblr page, the group's mission is to retain color to the past. All too often, these works go unseen in museums, art history classes, online galleries, and other venues because of retroactive whitewashing of medieval Europe, Scandinavia, and Asia. Sarah Bond, assistant professor in the classics department at the University of Iowa. Legends of America, Native American Timeline, 20th Century and Beyond. (1923), Special Indian Commissioner H.J. Hagerman organized the first Navajo Tribal Council, which gave him the power to act for them in auctioning oil leases. The tribal government was established following the discovery of oil on its reservation. 1929, if you notice, let's go back. says Native American timeline. Okay? Native American timeline. Doesn't say American Indian timeline. Because that would start with the first European. That would probably start with Columbus, because they couldn't you couldn't start it before that. Because we're presented with him being the first to land on the shores or discover us or to see us. So it would probably start with him, because he saw us. But this says Native American timeline, 20th century and beyond, 1900 and beyond. Native American timeline. So does a Native American timeline start there? Let's move on. 1929. On March 4th, 1929, Charles Curtis served as the first Native American U.S. Vice President under President Herbert Hoover. Herbert Hoover. On March 4th, 1929, Charles Curtis served as the first Native American U.S. Vice President under President Herbert Hoover. 1934. The Indian New Deal. The brainchild of Bureau of Indian Affairs Director John Collier was an attempt to promote the revitalization of Indian cultural, lingual, governmental, and spiritual traditions. The Indian New Deal, the brainchild of Bureau of Indian Affairs Director, which is a federal agency, John Collier. It was an attempt to promote the revitalization of Indian cultural, lingual, governmental, and spiritual traditions. Why would they need a revitalization for American, the original peoples of this soil? Why would you need a revitalization of their cultural, lingual, governmental, and spiritual traditions? They were living in them. They were being challenged, and they had been challenged, but they were living in them. They didn't go anywhere. When the wave of Europeans came here, they said mostly from Germany and Italy. Let's just take them, for example. They spoke German and Italian. Whatever they spoke, whatever Anglo-Saxon language they spoke, I don't know, just German and Italy. They didn't speak American. And they had to learn English. The Indian New Deal, the brainchild of Bureau of Indian Affairs Director John Collier, was an attempt to promote the revitalization of Indian cultural, lingual, governmental, and spiritual traditions. This blueprint for reform was written by non-Indians who felt they knew how to champion Indian rights. The brainchild of Bureau of Indian Affairs Director John Collier. This blueprint for reform was written by non-Indians. Okay. The 1950s, Cherokee Admiral Joseph J. Jocko Clark rose to command the U.S. 7th Fleet during the Korean War, making him the most powerful war chief in American Indian history. They called this man an American Indian falsely. He's a Native American. He's a foreigner. 1953, Congress seeks to abolish tribes, relocate American Indians, and passes a federal termination policy through which American Indian tribes will be disbanded and their land sold. Public Law 280 Public Law 280 transferred jurisdiction over the most tribal lands to state governments in California, Oregon, Nebraska, Minnesota, and Wisconsin. Alaska was added in 1958. Additionally, it provided that any other state could assume such jurisdiction by passing a law or amending the state's constitution. Cherokee Admiral Joseph J. Jocko Clark rose to command the U.S. 7th Fleet during the Korean War, making Admiral Joseph J. Jocko Clark the most powerful war chief in Native American history. Admiral Joseph J. Clark, Cherokee. Be careful what you call yourself. Make sure that's what your people called themselves. Well, Admiral Joseph, Jocko. He was doing an identity theft thing as well. Cherokee Admiral Joseph J. Jocko Clark. Nobody even questioned. This is ridiculous, and this is the Cherokee right here. This is the Cherokee, man. He's a Cherokee, man. Jocko. This is your Cherokee Indian right here. When your grandma or your Meemaw told you she was Cherokee, little did she know that old Jocko right here was going to come and steal her identity. Sheesh. 1990, the Native American Languages Act made it U.S. policy to preserve, protect, and promote the rights and freedom of Native Americans to use, practice, and develop. To use, practice, and develop Native American languages? Consequently, the federal government encourages and supports the use of native languages as a medium of instruction in schools, recognizes the right of Indian tribes to give official status to their languages for conducting their own business, supports proficiency in native languages by granting the same academic credit as for comparable proficiency in a foreign language. Right, because it's a foreign language. And encourages schools to include native languages in the curriculum in the same way as foreign languages. Right, because they're foreigners. Many American Indian languages have been lost. No, they haven't. I'm speaking one right now. It's called American. Indians currently speak less than 100 languages. 1906. The Burke Act amended the Dawes Act to give the Secretary of the Interior the power to remove allotments from the trust before the time set by the Dawes Act by declaring that the holders had adopted the habits of civilized life. On January 29th, 1907, Charles Curtis became the first Native American U.S. Senator. On January 29th, 1907, Charles Curtis became the first Native American U.S. Senator. This is why the Native American timeline starts in the early 1900s. Because that's when they were created, it appears. On January 29th, 1907, Charles Curtis became the first Native American U.S. Senator. This is Charles Curtis. This is Charles Curtis. Now, don't worry about it. I know the picture's small. And this is not about lookership. But come on, man. Come on, man. Charles Curtis, man, that ain't even his real. His people didn't come across the Atlantic named Curtis. Come on, man. Okay, let's do it. Wikipedia. And we're not using it as a primary. It's not a primary source, I know, but the things that we're going to read here, we're going to verify. Charles Curtis, born 1860, was an attorney and Republican politician from Kansas who served as the 31st Vice President of the United States. He had served as the Senate Majority Leader from 1924 to 1929, a member of the Kaw Nation, born in Kansas Territory. Curtis was the first Native American and first person in a racial minority group to reach either of the highest offices in the federal executive branch. So there's a few things here. He was a member of the Kaw Nation, born in the Kansas Territory. So he was born a Native American. Curtis was the first Native American and first person in a racial minority group. So they now, even though he's an Anglo-Saxon, he is a racial minority. So some Anglo-Saxons are racial minorities. So who are the majority? And first person in a racial minority group to reach either of the highest offices in the federal executive branch. Curtis believed that Native Americans could benefit from mainstream education and assimilation. He won several terms from his district in Topeka, Kansas, beginning in 1892 as a Republican to the U.S. House of Representatives. He sponsored and helped pass the Curtis Act of 1898, the Curtis Act, the Curtis Theater of 1898, which extended the Dawes Act to the 5 civilized tribes of Indian Territory. Okay. Early life. Charles Curtis had 3/8 Native American ancestry and 5/8 European American ancestry. Wait a minute. It's a lot going on here. Charles Curtis had 3/8 Native American ancestry. Apparently, they had a tool that measured fractions of blood. They could measure your blood to tell where your people came from. Native American ancestry and 5/8. Very precise. European American ancestry. Well, the 5/8 is a lie. I think it's a lot less than that because there's no such thing as a European American. He's a European who now lives in America, and he is therefore a Native American, somebody born in America. And as we can see, he calls himself a Native American. He says he's a Cherokee and he was born on the Kaw reservation. So from what I can see, he has denounced who he is. He has denounced his European lineage, rightfully so. Because if he does not denounce his European lineage, guess what? He can't be the face of the company. His mother Ellen Papin, also spelled Papin, was Kaw, Osage, Potawatomi, and French. See, a lot of things, but I'm going to go with the French. His father, Orrin Curtis, was of English, Scots, and Welsh ancestry. On his mother's side, Curtis was a descendant of a chief, White Plume of the Kaw Nation, and Chief Pauhuska of the Osage or Osage. This is Charles Curtis, Kansas, U.S. State Census Collection, Ancestry.com. It says Charles Curtis. This is the March 1st, 1905 census. Residence County, Shawnee. I know some people growing up who named Shawnee. Birthplace, Kansas. Birth year, 1860. Race, white. Ancestry, 1910. That was 1905 that we just looked at. That was 1905. His race is white. I think that's his wife, Anna Curtis. Daughter, Pamela. Harry, his son. Leona, his daughter. Teresa, his daughter. Ancestry.com, 1910 census. Charles Curtis, 50 years old in 1910. He is birth year about 1860 is what it says up here. Birth year about 1860 down here. He's 50. Kansas is his birthplace. Home, Topeka Ward, Shawnee, Kansas. Race, white. Occupation, senator. Industry, United States. Annie, Pamela, Harry, Leona, Teresa. So it matches up. This is the census, 1915, Ancestry. Residence County, Shawnee. He's still living in Shawnee County. Birthplace, Kansas. Birth year about 1860. He's still white. He's still a white man. Look at him. Do you agree? Although white doesn't tell us anything. He is an Anglo-Saxon, a Caucasian, an Afro-Eurasian. But we understand where they're coming from. Do you agree? This is your Native American. A prominent Native American. Okay. So this is from, where is this from? California IndianEducation.org. California IndianEducation.org. The phrase or expression Native American was coined by a handful of California tribal leaders in 1975 as a commendation for the nation's bicentennial 1776 to 1976 celebration. The phrase or expression Native American was coined by a handful of California tribal leaders in 1975 as a commendation for the nation's bicentennial 1776 to 1976 celebration. It was coined as a commendation. A commendation means the act of commending, praise, approbation, favorable representation in words, declaration of esteem, kind remembrance, respects, greetings, message of love. So it's a show of respect. To give you a better understanding of the reason for the invention of the term Native Americans, it's an invention. How can a people be an invention? To give you a better understanding of the reason for the invention of the term Native American, this is from the California IndianEducation.org website. The phrase or expression Native American was coined by a handful of California tribal leaders who look like our friend, who look like him, the tribal leaders, possibly. In 1975, as a commendation, as a show of respect, gratitude for the nation's bicentennial 1776-1976 celebration, it's a show of gratitude for the nation the nation of pale faces that supposedly committed terror on them. To give you a better understanding of the reason for the invention of the term Native American, I thought Native American was people. It's an invention. It's a term. But American Indians are people. I think you know. On January 4th, 1975, President Gerald Ford signed the most significant American Indian legislation on the United States of America, the Indian Self-Determination and Education Act of 1975. This single piece of legislation is that it forever changed the political relationship between the American Indian tribes and the United States government. Prior to the passage of the Indian Self-Determination and Education Act, the American Indian tribes had little or no control over their respective reservations or rancherias. I think they mean Native Americans. What do you think? The Bureau of Indian Affairs distribution of about 250,000 to 6 or 7 of the most powerful tribes for their input in developing a slogan or something memorable for the nation's bicentennial celebration. The tribal leaders that participated in the Bureau's bicentennial project included Banning Taylor, Los Coyotes, Dave Risling, Hoopa, Michael Donnelly, Campo, Emmett St. Marie, Morongo, Tony Pinto, Alec Garfield, Toole River, who also served as the chairman of the California Tribal Chairmen's Association. The term Native American was result of their efforts, and it caught on like wildfire. So now you know the true origin of the term Native American, coined 43 years ago. This is the guy who I think wrote the article, Ernie Salgado Jr. Soboba Band of Luceño Indians. Yeah. He's a Chino, Anglo-Saxon, Roman. This is a AI overview. No, just putting some in the search engine. And these are the answers I got when I asked the question. And I think it's an unbiased answer. The term Native American came into widespread use during the American Civil Rights Movement in the 1960s, primarily as a way to acknowledge the indigenous populations of the Americas as the original inhabitants of the continent before European colonization. It said 1960s right here with the AI, but what our good friend Ernie Salgado, what he said, based on his knowledge, I mean, he is a member of the Native Americans. He said the term Native American was the result of their efforts, and it caught on like wildfire. So now you know the true origin of the term Native American, coined 43 years ago. I think he said 1975, but the term Native American came into widespread use during the American Civil Rights Movement in the 1960s. The next one. No, the U.S. Constitution does not use the term Native American. Instead, it refers to Indian tribes within Article 1, Section 8, Clause 3, which is commonly known as the Commerce Clause, giving Congress the power to regulate commerce with Indian tribes. Not Native Americans. Native Americans are... Let's move on. The term Indian is considered offensive to Native Americans because it is a colonial term that originated from Christopher Columbus's mistaken belief that he had landed in India when he reached the Americas, essentially misidentifying the indigenous people he encountered. Thus, many Native Americans view it as a misnomer that perpetuates a historical misunderstanding and disregards their unique identities and diverse tribal nations. Or, in other words, because they're not American Indians, they are Native Americans. They are inventions. They were invented. AP News: why India's government wants to change the country's name to Bharat, by Sheikh Salid. This is 2023. New Delhi. Prime Minister Narendra Modi's government has replaced the name India with the Sanskrit word in dinner invitations sent to guests attending this week's Group of 20 summit, in a move that reflects his Hindu Nationalist Party's efforts to eliminate what it sees as a colonial era names. Indian President Drupadi Murmu is referred to as President of Bharat instead of President of India because he is the President of Bharat. America is India. America, India. Hence, us, the American Indians. And you think Cristobal didn't know this? I don't know him, so you tell me. Did he know? I mean, he was always messing around in the water since he was a little boy. In the invitation sent to G20 attendees, this is the G20 summit, I believe. And he says, I'm the president of Bharat. India is a colonial era thing. It was put on us. Why, I wonder. Could it be that it was part of the hijack? The identity theft? I mean, they do such a complete and thorough job. The nation of more than 1.4 billion people is officially known by two names, India and Bharat, but the former is most commonly used both domestically and internationally. Bharat, I spoke with an Indian lady at work, and she told me that North and South, I forget whether she said it was the North who use Hindustan or the South, and then the South or the North use Bharat. But the North and the South, one uses Hindustan, one commonly uses Bharat. She says that India, it's commonly called India when you're in the tourist parts of it, the tourist sections. Aside from that, it's either called Hindustan or Bharati. This is straight from an Indian person or a Hindu person. Bharat is an ancient Sanskrit word, which many historians believe dates back to early Hindu texts. The word also means India in Hindi. The change in nomenclature is backed by officials of Modi's Bharatiya Janata Party. They argue that the name India was introduced by British colonials and is a symbol of slavery. The British ruled India for about 200 years until the country gained independence in 1947. Modi's party has long tried to erase names related to India's Mughal and colonial past. Modi's government says the name change are an effort to reclaim India's Hindu past. India's opposition parties, however, criticize the move. While there is no constitutional objection to calling India Bharat, which is one of the country's two official names, I hope the government will not be so foolish as to completely dispense with India, which has incalculable brand value built up over centuries. Opposition lawmaker Shashi Tharoor said on X, it has brand value, commerce value. The New England Journal of Medicine. The New England Journal of Medicine. Indigenous Americans, the journal's historical Indian problem. By the time the journal was launched in 1812, Boston had witnessed 2 centuries of destructive confrontation between Europeans and indigenous Americans. Although some indigenous communities persisted in New England, most conspicuously in whaling, few indigenous people would have been visible on Boston streets. But away from the Atlantic coast, North America remained an indigenous continent. Over the ensuing years, the journal published thousands of articles that mentioned indigenous people, but far fewer that focused on them. This is from Indigenous Americans, the journal's historical Indian problem, the New England Journal of Medicine, volume 390, number 1. And it said in 1812. It said in 1812. And it said, but away from the Atlantic coast, North America remained an indigenous country. Where were your people in 1812? You should know. And if you don't know, go look. And then it says, an 1831 account praised garden sage, one of the most celebrated Indian remedies for cancer and ulcers. Sage dressing. Sage cornbread dressing. It's a beautiful thing. One of the most celebrated Indian remedies for cancer and ulcers. Such praise was often qualified. Physicians argued that though native healers had great powers of observation, they had no understanding of disease or therapeutic mechanism. Of course, they would say that they're not on their soil portion. They should go home. They need to go home. How they gonna tell you what'll cure you? How they gonna tell you what's best for you when they looking bad? Did you see them? Settlers did respect aspects of indigenous life. Many accounts in the early 19th century contrasted the hardiness and fortitude of savage life with the evils of civilized life. Indigenous Americans were capable of feats that would kill white people. The savage in northern climates is said to plunge with impunity at every season of the year into the coldest stream. Yet the health, if not the life, of an individual reared among the luxuries and refinements of civilized society would be endangered were he to attempt a similar course. An Illinois physician warned in 1839 about its perils. The rude Indian of the forest breathes the balmy air of his native abode, partakes of his simple repast, and rarely lays the sickened head to rest. Not so with the man whom education and refinement have placed in the high circles of life. When artful man interferes with nature, he suffers the penalty of sickness. Another reason for you to go home. Early authors were also fascinated by skin color. One doctor argued in 1844 that skin color reflected the wisdom of God, which each complexion suited to its climate. Intensely black to the purest white, as you recede from the equator to the frigid zone. Indigenous Americans were darker than they should have been. As land seizures increased over the 19th century, indigenous people were portrayed as obstacles and threats. An 1817 account described how mortal epidemics waged irregular warfare against the human species and resembled the barbarous nations of the earth, as the Algerians in Africa and the Indians of the American wilderness, who pillage and destroy after having given assurances of peace and friendship. Fear was not abstract. The journal published death notices of doctors, including many killed by indigenous people. An army doctor was massacred by the Indians in Florida in 1836. Another was captured and initially spared for his expertise, but a young savage who had lost a brother in the battle shot him dead. Such language served to justify and facilitate further conflict. As Europeans gained confidence in America, their fears gave way to scorn. Curiosity about indigenous therapeutics was replaced by disdain. When the Bureau of Indian Affairs sent physicians to reservations, their job description included inducing the Indian to discard the practices of their native medicine men and to substitute civilized treatment for superstitions and barbarous rites and customs. As white people's confidence in the superiority of their civilization grew, federal policy sought to civilize indigenous Americans. A 1910 essay contrasted the comparative immunity which English-speaking races possess toward alcoholism and the annihilating effects which it has when newly introduced into savage races like the American Indians. I'm sure we all have experienced that in our families. 1936, the Journal reprinted a New York Times article proclaiming red men thrive. The erstwhile vanishing Indian now has a birth rate that is probably the highest in the world. When they say the American Indian has a birth rate that is highest in the world, who do you think they're talking about? Who do you see mostly here? Go outside. Go to the store. Go to the gas station. Go anywhere. Who do you see? A journal, and then we got the whole Planned Parenthood thing that is diabolical. Not just them, but the people who walk through the front door as well. A journal editorial filmed that the Great White Father, despite bumper budgets of recent years, has turned out to be, in the case of his copper-colored children, an Indian Giver, a journal editorial film that the Great White Father, despite bumper budgets of recent years, has turned out to be, in the case of his copper-colored children, an Indian Giver, the original possessor of the country's fields and forests, now one of the world's most forgotten displaced persons or misclassified persons, surrendered these possessions after a struggle for the opportunity of living in squalor as a permanent guest of the nation. And we had some help. We had some movements that sought to give us all the opportunity to live in squalor, just to be next to some people. In response to a 1969 expose, Medicine in the Ghetto, do you see how this happens? We're talking about copper colored. We're talking about American Indian. We're talking about, let's go back up. Let's go back up. Let's go back up. Let's go back up. In response to a 1969 expose, Medicine in the Ghetto, I was looking for I guess it's on the previous page. Yeah. Let me see. Early authors were also fascinated by skin color. One doctor argued in 1844 that the skin color reflected the wisdom of God, with each complexion suited to its climate. I kind of disagree with that. Intensely black to the purest white as you recede from the equator to the frigid zone. I disagree with that because I've seen shows where I've seen Anglo-Saxon, Caucasian, European people in Michigan, and they don't look so good. That climate will be their detriment. But the niggers in Michigan look like the niggers anywhere else in America. Okay? In response to a 1969 expose, Medicine in the Ghetto, see, we're talking about people, darker people. We talking about we talking about this here. Let's see. He says indigenous Americans were darker than they should have been. In response to a 1969 expose, and now we're talking about Medicine in the Ghetto, one doctor reminded readers that hidden from public view and thus from public conscience, the first American, the American Indian, represents the poorest of the poor in this rich land and an undeniable indictment of our failure as a society. The Black America's Handbook for Survival Through the 21st Century, Radine A. America. The confusion they have about the validity of their relatives, Indian, of America ancestry is created based on the false perceptions of the racial images for what an Indian of America looks like. Unknown to Black America is the secret fact. These images of Native Americans are not the actual indigenous people to America. The images taught to them in primary education are based according to how the immigrants to America would like to perceive of themselves as the new heritage for the soil of America, aka Native Americans. This artificial narrative started by United States President Thomas Jefferson in the 1800s. The omission by the United States of the actual racial characteristics of being different shades of dark, reddish brown skin or tawny and curly hair as the ethnic physical characteristic of the original people by blood heritage females to America is used as a way to erase the absolute truth of the racial identity with the planet Earth heritage blood of the population of people to the Americas. The deception of the racial characteristics is so deeply rooted in the United States past that the truth is repeatedly ignored in favor of the United States romanticized ideal for racial ethnic identity of America narrative as of being of Euro-Asian origin. The use of this deception in the narrative of early American history education allows the United States to covertly maintain its societal hegemony, control over the new generations belonging to the heritage population of people to America, aka Negro, aka Black America, with the fundamental rights from heritage to America's soil. Today, this deception is compounded and perpetuated by Hollywood, higher education institutions, science, anthropology, and the mass media. The deliberate amnesia by the United States and the Negro patriarchy to the fact the skin color of all the original peoples of the Western Hemisphere as America are of dark skin or brown or tawny, racially identified first as red, politically called black, along with the fact that the real ethnic heritage identity belonging to the race population of Negro Black America is the Anasazi peoples to America, aka Amerindians, aka Indians of the Americas by blood heritage of their mothers belonging to the soil section of the planet Earth, Western Hemisphere called America. This amnesia conceals the United States covert war against the people by heritage of America for keeping foreign occupation in America and the enslavement of the indigenous populations of peoples born from America's heritage females with their soil from earth, including with their soil from earth. Each indigenous race created by Earth has a soil section or continent with the planet Earth. And if this ain't yours, you should go home. Indigenous heritage to the Western Hemisphere, known as the Americas, our ancestral name is Anasazi. People indigenous to America are ethnically classified as Amerindians, referred to as Negro Black America. The children born from the females of America or Amerindian heritage are labeled Negro. They are also referred to as children of the forest in America. The pyramid builders or mound builders is the given name to their massive civilization in the whole Western Hemisphere. The term indigenous is an international or global term to represent the original Earth people created by the planet Earth, designed to a section of soil with Earth to have as their home soil placement from Earth inheritance. As indigenous people of Earth, They have an unconditional earth covenant for eternity to live in that section of earth soil, soul, as a part of the natural life within the organism earth. In other words, the people who have sovereignty over the soil from the planet earth to the soil. What does the term Indian mean? It is a global collective term Europeans use to represent the individual indigenous person within the race collective of indigenous peoples of the earth. Indians of America, or Amerindians, is the collective population term used to identify the indigenous people living in the Western Hemisphere or New World, North, Central, and South America, including the Caribbean, Australia, New Guinea, Pacific Islands, Philippines. The term originally was applied only to people who look like the soil of the earth, as brown, tawny, dark, chocolate brown, aka red, skinned persons living in the Caribbean islands who represent the indigenous or original peoples living, thriving in the new section of earth soil discovered by Europeans before and during the time of discovery by Columbus. For thousands of years until 1705 to 1868, or until the overthrow of the culture and establishment of patriarchy, artifacts found in southeastern United States of America are older than the artifacts uncovered in Egypt. They date back as far as 7,000 to 12,000 years. It is written Amerindians populated every inch of America. The estimate of the population is from 500 million or more. In the United States, the population estimate in 1879 is 290 million, according to the Handbook of Federal Indian Laws. What heritage lineages make up the Anasazi culture of mound builders? Yamwea, Cherokee, Chickasaw, Muskogees, Knot Creeks, Choctaw, Blackfoot, Osage, Algonquin, Delawares, Tuscarora, Rickery, Mandan, Wichita, Tunica, Eastern Sioux, Shawano, Yamasee, Pawnee, Assiniboines, Minnetarees, Crows, Comanche, Oneida, Senecas, Piankeswas, Quapaws, Chippewa, Illinois, Sac and Foxes, Iowa, Cheyenne, Apache, Omaha, Ottos, Caddo, Kanza, Potawatomis, Pecota, Miamis, Kiowas, Kaskaskias, Mohawks, Mohegans, and thousands more. What is a matriarchal civilization? A matriarchal civilization is a name given to an indigenous culture designed by earth females around the principles of collective life awareness to the covenant of planetary life to earth, equality and gender respect for purpose, function, and the duality for oneness. In other words, the uninhibited expression of duality in emotion, keeping the essence of nature working with absolute reality of earth in all human form. Letters and Notes on the North American Indians, written in 1841 by author George Catlin. George Catlin, a noted ethnographer, describes Indians of America as all primitive tribes known in America are dark, copper-colored with jet black hair. As you read, there are no white-skinned people indigenous to America. Some Amerindians have straight hair, while most possess curls in the extreme and every level of wavy hair in between. Texture of hair is generally fine, soft as silk, or coarse and harsh. Catlin also noted The hair of men falling down to the hams and sometimes to the ground is divided into plats or slabs 2 inches width and filled with a profusion of glue and earth, which becomes very hard and remains unchanged from year to year. Catlin also commented, women used deer oil in their hair, and it was long and flowing in plaits or braids. Men wore their hair shaved with the top lock or totally bald. Who are the people from the Bering Strait? It is written the southwestern people migrated from Asia through the Bering Strait, and some of the modern Alaskan people migrated into the extreme northern tip of the Fertile Crescent, connected to North America thousands of years ago, mingling with the Anasazi people already living there. The southwestern people are the first immigrants from Asia into America. They are migratory people, or people who lived on the prairies or non forested areas of Earth in North America. They lived in the teepees and followed the route of the desert plains buffalo. They intermingled, traded, and adopted some of the culture of the established Anasazi Amerindian Negro communities. Anasazi Amerindians people did not come to America from Asia. Amerindian Negro people were here when the Asians came. This is another distortion of the truth promoted by the United States. So children of of America will ignore their mothers' and grandmothers' heritage blood connection to America with their kinfolks' ancestry, who are the original peoples called Indians of America or Amerindians, and only perceive their indigenous ancestry to America as an extinct race of people instead of seeing themselves as the continuation of the bloodlines of the human nature with America. First, the explorers would appear, then traders, whiskey, Christian missionaries, to allow the expansion of the destructive forces in the ego, to break the life awareness resolve of the young adults, then diseases, the settlers, and at last, the army. First, by offering people to visit their lands. Second, convincing the men to trade their females' life for trinkets. Third, by war, keeping indigenous communities of people at odds with each other. Amerindian males provided the slaves, mainly females and children, for exportation to other lands and domestic sale in Americas. This is from BDO, blackdoctors.org. Why most black people don't have Indian in their family. You probably heard it before, perhaps from your friends or some random person you met. More often than not, many black people say that they have Indian in their family. Some really do believe that they have a lineage of Native Americans in their bloodline. But in looking at the true line of African Americans, the truth is many do not have Indian in their family. Here's why. Those high cheekbones and that straight black hair derive from our high proportion of white ancestors, and not, for many of us at least, from our Cherokee great great grandmother on your daddy's side. But seriously, according to genealogists and scholars, a small percentage of African Americans do have significant amount of Native American ancestry, though almost no Black American person today has as much Native American ancestry as they do European ancestry by quite a long shot. This does not include Black peoples of Hispanic origin, in that Hispanic Americans tend to have far more Native American ancestry than African Americans do. Here are the statistics. Whereas virtually all African Americans have a considerable amount of European ancestry in their genomes, only 19% have at least 1% Native American ancestry, and only 5% of African American people carry more than 2% Native American ancestry. How do these percentages translate into ancestry? Well, if you have 5% Native American ancestry in your mix, that means you had one Native American ancestor 4 to 5 generations back, 120 to 150 years ago. If you have 2% Native American ancestry, you had one such ancestor on your family tree 5 to 9 generations back, 150 to 270 years ago. 1% of Native American ancestry means that this ancestor entered your bloodlines 6 to 10 generations back, 180 to 300 years ago. This timeline, however, presents a problem for explaining Native American ancestry in Blacks. By 1715, few Africans had arrived in North America through the slave trade. By 1715, few Africans had arrived in North America through the slave trade. In fact, according to the Transatlantic Slave Trade Database, only about 29,800 Africans had disembarked from slave ships by 1714, half before 1700 and half after. A very small part of the 388,000 or so Africans who would eventually arrive here, and from whom most of us are descended. The first of 3 large waves of Africans would surface in this country only after 1714. By 1750, for instance, some 145,970 had arrived. But most of these, as we can see, arrived after 1714. Therefore, for most of us, the odds of being descendant from an African who arrived in North America before 1700 and made it with the Native American, although possible, are very small. Black slaves made up about 12.5% of the total population in Indian Territory in 1860. Black slaves made up about 12.5% of the total population in Indian Territory in 1816. Aren't you bombarded with the 13% of the population today? Aren't you still called 13% of the population? The 13% number is interesting, right? Black slaves, black workers, made up 12.5% of the total population in Indian Territory in 1860. A sufficient ratio within a recent enough period to mate rather broadly and leave a significant genetic legacy among African Americans today. In other words, if you can trace your ancestry to black ancestors living in what is now Oklahoma between 1840 and 1908, your chances of being among the genetic 5%ers is much higher than for any other African Americans. Any chances are you probably do have a significant amount of Native American ancestry. And chances are you probably do have a significant amount of Native American ancestry. If you don't descend from ancestors who live with these Native American tribes or in Oklahoma, the odds are much greater you have very little Native American ancestry. Maybe the better question is, why are most black people not happy just to have African in their family? Blackdoctor.org asks, why are most black people not happy just to have African in their family? Well, because most of us don't have any African in our family. And also, since Native Americans are inventions and were invented in the 1970s, blackdoctor.org has some explaining to do and some more research. Do the right thing.